It's Wisconsin Today. I'm Kate Archer-Kent.
And I'm Rob Farrett. 2 weeks ago, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Budget Reconciliation Bill, labeled the Big Beautiful Bill. It passed by one vote, 215 to 214.
Now it's moved to the Senate, where Democrats are voicing opposition because of major cuts to programs like SNAP and Medicaid. But there also are a few Republican senators who say they plan to vote no if there aren't changes to the budget, mostly focused on the size of the deficit.
That includes Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson, who joins us now. Senator Johnson, welcome to Wisconsin Today.
Morning, guys. Thanks for having me on.
What is your main point of contention with the bill as it passed the House?
Well, first of all, I think the lack of focusing on the facts and figures during the House passage is the first thing we need to address. So without belaboring on too many facts and figures, let me just lay out the basics. 2019, the federal government spent $4.4 trillion. This year we'll spend over $7 trillion. That's a 58% increase. It's unprecedented other than World War II. We have to return to a reasonable pre-pandemic level of spending. If you look at CBO's 10-year projection, I know the House talked about $1.5 trillion. Sounds like a lot, but in context of CBO's projected $89.3 trillion of 10-year spending, and in light of their $22 trillion projected deficit, that would be $2.2 trillion per year of deficits. And let me put that in context. President Obama, because of the Tea Party pressure, in his first term, spent about $1.3 trillion annual deficits. Restrained in the second term is about $550 billion. Trump came in, first three terms, had to do deals with Democrats, that up to 810. Of course, then COVID hit as a $3.1 trillion a year deficit. And again, responsible leadership would have returned to certainly under $1 trillion worth of deficits in the following years once the economy and was recovering and employment was returned. But that didn't happen. Biden, on average, he averaged deficits of $1.9 trillion. And that's our starting point. That's apparently the new normal. I'm not accepting a new normal. And unfortunately, the Big Beautiful Bill pretty well accepts that new normal. We're not bending the deficit trajectory curve downward. And that ought to be the first goal of a Senate, any kind of Republican budget reconciliation process.
House Speaker Mike Johnson has urged Republican senators, including you, to support the bill. Here's what he told NBC's Meet the Press after saying he agrees with you about government spending.
We can't flip a magic switch and reverse it overnight, but this is the largest step forward in the right direction that Congress has ever made. I liken this to an aircraft carrier. You don't turn an aircraft carrier on a dime. It takes a mile of open ocean. This is the biggest turn in that wheel that we would have had in generations.
Okay, maybe not the full deal there, Senator Johnson, but a good first step. What do you think?
Well, listen, I also respect Speaker Johnson. I understand his challenge, but that's just rhetoric. Again, look at the facts and figures. One of the reasons we weren't able to turn that ship a little bit sharper is we never looked at the facts and figures. We pulled $1.5 trillion out of the air, completely out of context. It's not meeting the moment. So in order to actually pass something, you need to make the case. You have to win the argument. You have to show, like I just did in my latest chart, those 4-year deficit figures going from 550 under Obama, 810 under Trump, then the $3.1 trillion under COVID, and then Biden keeping it at $1.9 trillion. Again, you have to look at those figures and then look at the CBO projections and realize this piece of legislation does not bend that deficit curve down. It isn't even close to returning us to subpar, even $1.5 trillion year deficits. We're at 1.9, heading toward 2.5. So again, it's simply not meeting the moment. It's completely inadequate, but you have to talk about facts and figures. This is a budget reconciliation process, and all we're really hearing is slogans and rhetoric, not substance and figures.
Where do you see cuts needing to be made in the spending?
It literally, you have to go through every line of the federal budget. There's over 2,000 of them. You have to forensically audit over 2,600 federal government programs. I have to believe, and DOGE has shown us this, if you do that, if you put the spending under a microscope, there would literally be hundreds of billions of dollars throughout the federal budget that if you eliminated it, nobody would even notice other than the grifters who are sucking down the waste, fraud, and abuse. But you have to do the work. That takes time. Trying to rush a piece of legislation as complex and big as this through the process, by July 4th, you're not going to do the work. Again, so we've done the same old process we've always done, exempt most programs, focus on a couple, make a couple tweaks, get a CBO score, pick a number out of the air and say, oh, this is a lot. This is historic. We've never done this before. Well, again, we've never increased spending by 58% from $4.4 to $7 trillion before. We need a much greater response to that grotesque level of spending excess.
Your Democratic colleagues have said, hey, you're not going to get this kind of spending reduction just by doing a waste, fraud, and abuse. Senator Tammy Baldwin, your Wisconsin Democratic colleague, worried about cuts to SNAP and Medicaid. Independent analysis by the Joint Economic Committee says between Affordable Care Act coverage and Medicaid, more than 200,000 Wisconsin residents would likely lose health insurance coverage under the plan as written. Does that concern you about the impact on Wisconsin?
Well, first of all, that's rhetoric again. You're basing it on scores from somebody. What you'd hope is a lot of people would move from Obamacare, and that's what we're talking. We're not talking about doing anything with Medicaid for vulnerable, disabled children or pregnant women or the truly vulnerable. We're talking about Obamacare, which is now called Medicaid expansion, which is for single, able-bodied, working-age adults who aren't working, who should be working, who should be getting their health insurance by getting a job. And that Obamacare expansion, you got to understand this. For every dollar the state spends on traditional Medicaid, the federal government kicks in $1.33. Again, it was supposed to be a shared responsibility administered by the states, so the states would control it. So they wouldn't offer it to ineligible individuals, wouldn't expand it where it becomes completely unaffordable. Obamacare, for every dollar the state spends, the federal government kicks in $9, which has led to all kinds of what I would call legalized fraud on the parts of state governments and those providers, provider fees, provider taxes. That's not health care, but the federal government reimburses that on 90 cents on the dollar. Again, it's unsustainable. It's Obamacare. It's not Medicaid. We all support Medicaid for the vulnerable. Again, this is all rhetoric from the other side. It's fear-mongering, which is what the big spenders always do, which is why we're $37 trillion in debt. And apparently they're okay with going from $4.4 trillion to over $7 trillion in spending. I'm not. And I don't think the American public is for that if they actually understand the figures. And by the way, this can't go on. This can't go on. This massive deficit spending, this massive debt, it's going to blow up in our face sooner rather than later. And we've already experienced a chronic debt crisis, which is the devalued our dollar. A dollar you held in 2019 is only worth 80 cents. A dollar you held in 1998, when Clinton had a balanced budget, is worth 51 cents. That's the silent tax on everybody, particularly hurting the poor and the vulnerable. So again, I am fighting for our children and grandchildren and for fiscal sanity.
Talking to U.S. Senator Ron Johnson about the federal budget bill. How about the revenue side, Senator Johnson? A big part of that gap is coming from the 2017 tax cuts. Would you be willing, in the interest of cutting the deficit, to say, hey, we're not going to expand tax cuts? Maybe we can take another look at those 2017 cuts.
No, I do not want to increase anybody's taxes. We are back to basically a 50-year average of revenue as a percentage of GDP. Even though we had that tax cut, we started out about 17.1% of revenue as part of percentage of GDP. We're back to 17.1. No matter how much you punish success, and I've got a great chart on this, whether it was 91% top marginal rate, 70, 50, all we're able to extract from the economy, from the American taxpayer, is about 17.1% of GDP. We need to recognize that reality, and we have to start bringing spending back in line with that. So again, you can try punishing success. It just doesn't work.
A non-fiscal item in this budget bill that's gotten some attention in Wisconsin. The bill includes a 10-year moratorium on state and local regulation of AI technology. Now, 3 Wisconsin lawmakers, 2 Republicans and a Democrat, signed a letter to Congress saying, hang on, don't take away our ability to control this and respond to local concerns. What do you think about that effectively non-fiscal item in this budget bill?
I don't like it because it hasn't been discussed. It hasn't been debated. This is an incredibly complex issue. AI, and I'm using it right now just in terms of the budget debate. I'm doing sensitivity analysis on the CBO projection. It's marvelous. It's a great tool, but it could be unbelievably dangerous as well. So it's hard to say what is the right level of regulation on this. This is a very complex issue. So, I don't like including this kind of policy thing. By the way, I doubt this is going to survive the bird bath. I don't see how that could even And that's all policy. I don't understand what the budgetary impact of that would be at all.
Getting to the politics of this, Senator Johnson, Republicans in the Senate have a few votes to spare, not many. You're one vote. Do you have enough people, you think, on your side to make significant changes to this bill?
I'm fairly confident we do. And again, we want to see President Trump succeed. He's doing things that have to be done that no other president would do. So I totally support him. I want to see him succeed. I think you have to take a couple bites of the apple here. The only way we're going to be able to take the time to explain this to the American public, all the things we're doing. I mean, you rush something through, that's where you're vulnerable to false attacks on what you're trying to do. So you need to take the time to forensically audit these programs, the spending, but you also have to take the time to explain it to the American public. We haven't taken that time. We need to.
And what do you say to your colleagues in the other chamber? A one-vote margin approved this thing. Any tweaks could spoil that coalition. What do you say to your Republican colleagues to support changes that you are attempting to put through?
Well, the president was able to twist arms in the House to pass this grossly inadequate package. So my guess is if we skinny this thing down, focus on the areas of agreement, things that have to be done, that ought to be a pretty easy sell to the House.
Senator Johnson, we'll leave it there. Thanks again for joining us today.
Have a great day.
That's U.S. Senator Ron Johnson. He represents Wisconsin in the United States Senate. He joined us to talk about his opposition to the budget reconciliation bill as currently written. It's currently being debated in the Senate. What do you think about this bill as it's passed the House, now up for argument in the Senate? What do you want to see happen? What do you worry might happen? Tell us what's on your mind in this big package. Email WisconsinToday@WPR.org. That's WisconsinToday@WPR.org with your thoughts.
Coming up, the White House is concerned that too many children are medicated for ADHD. A UW-Madison researcher gives an update on this neurodevelopmental condition.
We are not sure exactly what the true rate of ADHD is. And so the idea of over-prescribing ADHD medications is really difficult to come to.
That's next on WPR News. It's Wisconsin Today. I'm Kate Archer-Kent.
And I'm Rob Farrett. A report from the White House argues there are proven harms associated with overtreating children with medications for depression or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD.
Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s Make America Healthy Again report blames ultra-processed foods, environmental chemicals, lack of physical activity, chronic stress, and excessive use of prescription drugs as culprits for causing chronic diseases in children.
This comes as the Trump administration has placed drugs for ADHD under additional scrutiny, with Kennedy claiming the medications are overprescribed and, quote, poisoning children.
To learn more about the latest research and treatment for ADHD, which affects more than 10% of kids nationwide, we're joined by a Wisconsin clinical psychologist. James Lee is the A.A. Alexander Associate Professor of Psychology and an investigator at the Waisman Center at UW-Madison. James, welcome to Wisconsin Today.
Thank you so much for having me.
How would you describe the ADHD diagnosis and how that definition is thought about today versus how it's changed over the decades?
Well, ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and it's a disorder that's characterized by developmentally inappropriate levels of inattention and hyperactivity. It's typically diagnosed in kids, as generally we would see these sort of symptoms emerge early in life. It's what's called a neurodevelopmental disorder, and so what that means is that it's believed to have very early origins that have a strong biological component to it. And I think your question in terms of how it's changed over time is that at least in the last 20, 25 years, our understanding, our definition of what ADHD is hasn't really changed. However, what has changed is our awareness of it, parents' recognition of it as a problem that can be treated, and a lot more kids these days are being diagnosed with it as prevalence rates have risen pretty drastically over the last 25 years. So while we haven't really changed much in our, at least the field's view of what it is, certainly most people, or at least a lot more people these days, are aware of it.
And we're going to get more into the prevalence, but is there a reliable test to diagnose it in clinic?
Yeah, so the way that ADHD diagnoses are done are usually very multifactorial. So what that means is that you actually need a lot of different types of tests and instruments in order to do it correctly, which I would say not everyone typically does because of how much is required. So generally speaking, in order to be following best practices for the diagnosis, you have to do an interview with the caregiver in the case of a child. So that usually entails asking a series of questions related to the presence of a number of symptoms related to ADHD and to what extent are they present in multiple settings, as ADHD is a disorder that needs to be present in not just at home or at school, but in multiple places. It also requires some level of observation. So generally that would look like a clinician who might go into a classroom and actually observe the child to see whether or not some of the symptoms that are reported are also there in front of their eyes. And also there's a component of neuropsych testing as well. This is where the child might come in for a number of hours and take some tests to assess their level of attention on a number of lab-based tests. And all of these different measures are supposed to be gathered and then shown to be reliable in terms of to what extent is there impairment across all of these different measures for ADHD.
You know, boys are more likely to be diagnosed, although that might be changing from what I understand. Why are there gender differences?
Yeah, that's the $5 million question of our science is why are there gender differences, not only in ADHD, but in so many of the neurodevelopmental disorders. There's a lot of theories and hypotheses as to why there might be gender differences. Some of the leading ones include the fact that there might just be sort of a societal appreciation or maybe underappreciation for ADHD symptoms in girls. Inattention might resemble or what we think of like anxiety symptoms. So girls tend to be more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety disorders, whereas boys might be more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, even though what is apparent could be very similar. It just looks like a kid who's, daydreaming and not really focused on school. And so that could really be more of a societal bias around how teachers and parents kind of view these sorts of things. From a biological standpoint, there really hasn't been any compelling lines of evidence from brain imaging studies to genetics that suggest that there could be different, regions of the brain that are lighting up that might, have us see more boys be diagnosed than girls. And there could be a lot of other reasons too, but these are sort of the two lines that have been most studied. And right now, the most compelling line seems to be more of the societal bias around how inattention generally looks in boys relative to girls.
So as of 2022, more than 9% of children took medication for mental health or concentration. Those are CDC numbers. Do you think are too many children taking medication for ADHD?
I think that we might have an issue where we are not sure exactly what the true rate of ADHD is. And so the idea of over-medicalizing or over-prescribing ADHD medications is really difficult to come to because you first have to know what exactly is the true rate of ADHD in the population. And because we've worked so hard in our field as mental health scientists and practitioners to sort of break down the stigma of mental illness and to sort of encourage parents and children to get help for mental health concerns, including ADHD, it's really unclear as to whether or not these rising rates of medication and diagnoses are actually supposed to be what we're observing. Is in fact maybe we're trying to get to a point that needs to be higher because that's what the true rate is. On the other hand, maybe we are over-diagnosing and over-medicalizing ADHD. And I think that's right now an open question because we just don't know what the true rate of ADHD really is.
So then why are stimulants like Adderall and Ritalin and others, why are they an effective way to treat and to manage ADHD?
There are basically two types of medications that are widely used to treat ADHD at this time. So one line that you've referred to are what are called stimulants, and they're the ones that are most well studied. Stimulant medications all work very similarly. They're basically a class of drugs that target two neurotransmitters in the brain. They're dopamine and norepinephrine. And the reason why they're so effective at treating symptoms of ADHD, specifically in attention and focus, is because they target the parts of the brain that regulate executive functions, decision-making, also working memory and focus. So that's what dopamine does. It's sort of like the reward chemical of your brain, and it kind of lights up whenever we, do something that we're really interested in. And so by targeting this particular pathway, we're able to, light up the parts of our brain that's focusing on whatever it is that we're focusing on better. And the other neurotransmitter is norepinephrine, which has a sort of similar neurochemical component to it as dopamine. It's the reason why these drugs are so instantaneous as well. Stimulant medications generally work within the hour as soon as they're taken. And by taking stimulant medications, especially these days, the medications that are on the market, they are pretty long lasting, so they actually can last for the whole day before the effects start to wear off. But you do have to take these medications on a daily basis. The downside of these types of medications, though, is that A, you have to take them every day for the efficacious effects to take hold, but B, there is a abuse potential associated with these particular drugs. They're called stimulants for a reason, and that also means that people who don't have ADHD can very easily misuse them, can abuse them and use them for other, non-prescription reasons and get a hold of them in sort of illicit sort of ways. And so this is one of the reasons why they're so highly regulated is because of the abuse potential. But when they're prescribed and used, with the prescription, they're only prescribed and used at a dosage that's meant to be therapeutic and have a very low potential for abuse when they're used therapeutically.
We're talking about one of the neurodevelopmental disorders, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. James Lee is here, the A.A. Alexander Associate Professor of Psychology and an investigator at the Waisman Center at UW-Madison. James, we heard Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has claimed that environmental factors may be behind the rise in autism and other illnesses. How do environmental factors affect the likelihood of someone developing ADHD?
I mean, that's a very large component of what underlies the development of ADHD over time is not just your biology and your genetics, which of course does play a huge role, but so does your environment and the environment that you're raised in. So from the research that I've done in my lab, we've shown that parenting style, parenting behaviors, parental monitoring plays a pretty big role in affecting the way that your genes work, the genes that you might carry for ADHD, that they're more likely to be expressed under environmental conditions that are, let's say, a little bit more lax or perhaps adverse. We've also found in my lab that exposures to early childhood traumas and early childhood adversities also increases a child's risk for developing ADHD. And again, this is in concert with their biology, looking alongside their genes. So it's really a matter of not just one or the other, which I think our health secretary seems to be conflating, saying that it's really more of an environmental thing. It's both. And not just both, it's the interactions between the two and how your biology and your genetics interacts with the environments that you're in.
So with that said, how could parents and caregivers in that child's life create a more supportive environment so the child can really complete their tasks and succeed better with ADHD?
Yeah, one of the empirically supported treatments, psychosocial treatments for ADHD is what's called parent management training. And it's very effective. And in fact, it's part of the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines for treatment providers who are working with parents. with kids with suspected ADHD is a parent management form of training. And this type of intervention focuses mostly on teaching parents how to reinforce pro-social behaviors while also teaching them skills to manage some of those more maladaptive type of behaviors like fidgeting, not sitting still, not paying attention. A lot of these things are, in fact, of course, behavioral and can be managed with some good old-fashioned behavioral interventions, which have been around for a very long time and are quite efficacious. Where medications could be also useful is that they can enhance a lot of these behavioral interventions at the home and even at school. But to say that just medications alone are efficacious is actually incorrect. It's the recommendation by the American Academy of Pediatrics is, in fact, both of these in tandem with one another are quite efficacious. But as I just explained, changing the environment is a pretty big component of treating ADHD. It's not just the biology component.
As you mentioned, those early interventions could include prescriptions. And Health Secretary Kennedy has said, called prescription stimulants harmful, saying children have been, quote, poisoned by taking these medications. What is your response to his concerns about prescriptions?
My response is that there is absolutely no scientific basis for any of those statements. Those who have studied this and who have spent many decades studying ADHD and other neurodevelopmental disorders know the evidence is quite clear that the medications that are currently FDA approved and prescribed to treat ADHD in particular are fairly well tolerated. They don't lead to early mortality, or at least there's no evidence of that. And they are generally very beneficial when used properly, under doctor's orders, of course, and in conjunction with high-quality psychosocial interventions like parent management training. So I do agree, maybe not necessarily directly with the health secretary's statements about toxicity about medications, but at least with the idea that environment does play a pretty substantial role in mental health conditions in children. But it shouldn't be the only thing that we think about when it comes to intervention. It should be in concert with how we can also address the underlying biology that we currently know of that's quite relevant to these disorders.
So what I'm hearing is that genetics has a role, your genes are expressing, and then also that interacts with the environment around you.
That's absolutely right, yeah. Mm-hmm. And genes actually, to put it into some perspective, for ADHD, based on about 25 years of twin literature and recent genome-wide association studies, it's estimated that genes explain something like 70 to 80% of the variation underlying ADHD, which means that genetics play a outsized role in the contributions to the cause of ADHD over time. Now, as I mentioned earlier, just because you carry the genes for ADHD doesn't mean that they'll be expressed. And that's epigenetics is helping us to better understand how do we know which genes get expressed and which don't. And that's really what we're learning from doing these studies of gene-environment interactions, is that these stressful environments can actually exacerbate our underlying genetic risks. If we carry these genetic risks, it's probably best if we can intervene early at the environmental level so that we maybe don't need to access, medications younger in life, right? That would be preferred, of course. But again, to sort of conflate ADHD or autism as strictly an environmentally caused condition, I think is not rooted in any sort of scientific reality.
James Lee, where is the research headed in ADHD? What does Weissman Center want to focus on next?
That's a great question. So right now we have a very big study that's looking at ADHD as a co-occurring condition with other neurodevelopmental disorders. I've mentioned this earlier, but ADHD is part of a constellation of other conditions in the DSM that are called neurodevelopmental disorders. Included in them is autism. And we know that among the autistic community, roughly 50% of them struggle with ADHD and ADHD-like traits. It's one of the biggest co-occurring conditions that autistic individuals struggle with the most. And we know very little about how to treat ADHD in individuals who have these co-occurring conditions like autism. one of the really, one of the really disappointing things about the ADHD research is that it's been primarily focused on individuals who've been screened for and specifically meet criteria for ADHD and only ADHD, which means that for a large subset of individuals out there who might carry co-occurring conditions, including ADHD, we just really don't know if these treatments are even efficacious for them at all. And that's specifically, I'm referring to autistic individuals. So the really compelling finding that led us to do our research on this group of autistic individuals with ADHD is that there's a meta-analysis that came out a couple years ago that showed that autistic kids who were given stimulant medications to treat their ADHD symptoms actually had more adverse events and adverse risk profiles as a result of taking these medications, which are FDA approved and supposed to be safe. But these autistic kids who were given these medications actually did not fare better, and in many cases actually fared worse because they experienced a lot more adverse risk profiles as a result of taking the medication, which would suggest that these traditional medications that we're using to treat ADHD may not actually be effective in treating ADHD for certain individuals. So that's sort of where the field is headed, is thinking about ADHD not just as its own thing, but kind of as part of other co-occurring conditions for which ADHD tends to show up in so many different conditions as well.
James, thank you so much for the conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
That is clinical psychologist James Lee, the A.A. Alexander Associate Professor of Psychology and an investigator at the Weissman Center at UW-Madison. We've been talking about the latest research and treatment for ADHD as the White House scrutinizes the medications used to treat the disorder in children.
Still ahead, wild rice, or manumin, is a vital plant for Ojibwe and other Great Lakes tribes, but it's declined in recent years. Two co-authors of a new report tell us the plant needs protection, especially in the face of climate change.
There are measurable actions we can take right now that will actually provide some protection to manumin and its habitat.
That's next from WPR News.
This is Wisconsin Today. I'm Kate Archer-Kent.
And I'm Rob Farrett. It's time now for Wisconsin Life. Here's producer Maureen McCollum with a story about a small business owner in southern Wisconsin.
Adrian Molitor knows a thing or two about hardwood floors. With his Madison-based business, Molitor Traditional Flooring, he's restored historic floors in some of southern Wisconsin's most iconic homes and businesses. Jess Miller caught up with Molitor to talk with him about why the old, weathered wood speaks to him.
The Molitor Traditional Flooring crew is hard at work in Madison's LaFlorian Co-op, a massive yellow castle on Lake Mendota, scraping old finish off the living room's red oak floor. The floors that business owner Adrian Molitor works on are special. Most of them are more than a century old. Preserving history, he says, is a point of pride.
I don't care about new construction. I actually despise the look of it. You know what I mean? I love all things old. Patina is like who I am, as a person.
Today, business is steady. New clients come almost exclusively from referrals. But unlike one of his handmade parquet designs, Molitor's path here was anything but clear-cut. As a teenager in Madison, Molitor dropped out of high school, bought a Ford Econoline van, and headed west in search of the American dream.
It was kind of like that lifestyle is influenced by the music of the Grateful Dead. That was like my whole thing at that point in my life. And still really now, today, my life is very much influenced by kind of the folklore and mystery of Americana.
He cut his teeth doing grunt work at a hardwood flooring business in Tucson. It wasn't glamorous.
But I knew that I really enjoyed being tired at the end of the day,
He came back to Madison, found work as a tattoo artist, and discovered a love for traditional American designs.
Which is almost like, when I think about the type of wood working that I'm doing now, I almost feel like it's in some way related to traditional Americana art. It's like, these are the images. You don't have to change them too much. You have to stay true to some sort of form or tradition, but from there's a little bit of room,
More than a decade ago, Molitor was struggling with alcohol, mental health problems, and substance abuse.
I guess in 2012, I had, racked up a fourth OWI and then also a drug charge. And so I was a felon. And I reached that moment, I kind of had that moment in my life where lightning struck inside of me, where I was like, wow, some people around me really, saved my life. I had to be cut completely down to nothing and start my life entirely over. I didn't drive a car for 5 or 6 years in my recovery in the beginning, and rode my bike around Madison, washed dishes, paid off my debts, did everything I could, and just continued to stay sober.
Molitor eventually made it to college. Inspired by the Grateful Dead, Bob Dylan, and beat poets, he studied poetry and English literature.
And I stuck with it, and I got into the University of Wisconsin in the arts at 40, which, was a big ego boost, right? I was really proud of myself. I worked really hard, but I hated it. I didn't have any peers there that I could relate to. I was this guy with my story, and I just felt really disconnected.
So he turned to what he knew, woodworking.
I started my company out of a Hyundai Sonata with rental equipment and about 15 years experience, and I made sure everything was perfect.
Molitor's first clients were folks who knew him as a hardworking community member. They didn't care about his background or his dozens of tattoos, a physical patina he accumulated over the years. The work itself was its own reward.
Knowing that with the sweat of your brow, you're pounding in a hardwood floor that will outlive the person that's paying you to install that hardwood floor, and that's incredible.
Looking back on his long, strange trip, Molitor says he wouldn't change a thing. He contributes to his community. He supports a growing family. Last year, he welcomed a third son, August. And for all the floors he's restored already, there are as many more, waiting for their chance at a new life.
Whenever they say, keep going, John.
That story on Adrian Molitor was produced by Jess Miller, a Wisconsin Life production assistant. Wisconsin Life is a co-production of Wisconsin Public Radio and PBS Wisconsin. Additional support comes from Lowell and Mary Peterson of Appleton. Want to catch every Wisconsin Life story? Subscribe to our podcast. Find more Wisconsin Life at wisconsinlife.org and on Facebook and Instagram. I'm Maureen McCullum.
This is Wisconsin Today.
Wild rice, called manoomin in Ojibwe, is a sacred plant to Great Lakes tribes, but according to a new study, there's less of it to harvest in Wisconsin lakes and wetlands than in past years.
According to a new report in the Nature journal Communications, Earth and Environment, climate change is partly to blame for the declining availability of manoomin each year.
Madeline Nyblade from the University of Minnesota was a lead author for the report. Two co-authors of the paper join us now. Brandon Byrne is the inland fisheries biologist and former wetlands biologist at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, or GLFWC, and Rob Kroll is policy analyst and climate change coordinator, also at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. Rob, welcome to Wisconsin Today.
Thanks for having us.
And Brandon, thanks for being with us.
Yes, absolutely. Pleased to be here.
Before we get to the report itself, can you talk about what we've seen when it comes to our longer-term trends with wild rice? It sounds like, if I'm reading this right, Brandon, that there's been a decline over the years.
Yeah, exactly. So, kind of in this paper that Maddie put out, it looked at, several sources of long-term data, both from GLFWC and our sister agency, the 1854 Treaty Authority, among others, and kind of what it's found is that, over the years, at least since we've been collecting these data, that overall the abundance of manoomin and sort of its presence within regional watersheds has declined over the past few decades.
And Rob, as the climate change program coordinator there, how do you try to figure out how much of that decline can be linked to climate change?
That's a difficult thing to kind of suss out. Maddie did a really good job with her research, looking at some of the impacts that we're seeing up here in terms of changes in water levels at certain times of the year, in the length of winter and ice thickness and duration. But recognize that you have to look at manoomin holistically. It's as vulnerable as a plant can be just because of its very nature. It's vulnerable to land use changes, water use changes, pollution, impacts from motorboat use and high wakes. So you can't just look at climate change in a silo. You have to look at it holistically.
And Brandon, you've worked also as a wetlands biologist. Can you talk about what it is about wild rice monomen that makes it vulnerable to some of those things Rob was just talking about?
Yeah, monomen or wild rice has sort of a very narrow window of environmental conditions in which it can really, be successful. And so that involves, water depths from about 6 inches to 3 feet, slow flow, and relatively cool water. And so, in its early stages is kind of when it's most susceptible to these environmental changes. And we often refer to that as the floating leaf stage. In this stage, its root system is not quite anchored within the sediment. And so, kind of like Rob was saying, not only is it vulnerable to sort of weather or climatic variables, it's also vulnerable to motorboat use. So, if a motorboat goes by a wild rice bed, kind of when it's early on in its growth, that those wakes from that boat have potential to uproot it when it's kind of in its early and most vulnerable stages. And so it's really just its ecology overall is very delicate and kind of susceptible to um, factors around it when it's young.
Interesting. So, Rob, with climate change as an extra variable, what are some of the worries in our year-to-year weather that might affect this plant, especially maybe at those early stages of its growth?
Sure. One of the things that we're seeing and will continue to see is um, our precipitation coming less frequently but more intensely. So much heavier rainstorms, which can cause quick floods, which, during the floating leaf stage that Brandon mentioned, will uproot the plant. And then later on in its growth, when there are seeds on the plant, if we get these big storms and heavier winds, which we've been getting later on in the year, it can devastate a rice bed just by blowing the stalks down into the water.
Brandon, as part of this study, I understand you helped contribute some new data about wild rice in the Great Lakes region. What kind of things, what kind of information are you working to glean and that ended up contributing to this overall report?
Yeah, so really, what I worked with in this paper is kind of the more recent data collection of an ongoing monomen monitoring program that GlyphWorks has had. I think since the early 90s. You're essentially going to a wild rice water body, a known wild rice water body, and measuring the number of plant stalks that are within a half-meter square. When you have all these variables sort of year after year, that can kind of paint a kind of a broader picture of what's going on in a particular lake. In 2014, we had Tanya Cherland had published the Wild Rice Monitoring Handbook. And so we sort of tweaked our methods to be more in line with what was in Tanya's document. So we are now sampling fewer lakes. We've gone from roughly 40 lakes in a year to about 10. But then within those 10 lakes, we have a higher sampling intensity.
Rob, I understand there's a move, in addition to the kind of data Brandon is talking about, to use traditional ecological knowledge, sometimes abbreviated TEK, in this kind of study. Can you talk a little bit about that concept of using this traditional ecological knowledge in our scientific work?
Sure, and recognizing that I'm speaking as an employee of GlyphWorks and not a tribal member, so I'm not talking about my culture. The term we often use here at GlyphWorks in the Ojibwe language is Ojibwe Kikindasowin, Ojibwe knowledge. And what that reflects is long-term place-based observational knowledge from people that have lived in a place for a really long time and interacted with that place and the beings that live there and have seen changes and have reacted to those changes on the landscape. In our program, we use both the best available science, but then also interviews and conversations with Ojibwe knowledge holders to help us think about the impact of climate change and other environmental stressors on culturally important beings like Manuman and how it impacts Ojibwe lifeways. The tribes signed treaties with the US government back in the 1800s, and in those treaties, it specifically mentioned the ability to gather wild rice on the waters outside the reservations is an inherent right that the Ojibwe people kept for themselves in those treaty negotiations. As we see a decline in rice, that impacts the ability of the Ojibwe today to continue to practice their culture and their life ways.
We are talking about the decrease of manoomin, a wild rice plant in the Great Lakes region. We have Brandon Byrne and Rob Kroll with us from the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. Brandon, are there lessons we can take from this research on protecting wild rice and the habitat it grows in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important not to forget that there are measurable actions we can take right now that will actually provide some protection to manoomin and its habitat. And so kind of on an individual level, exercising caution if you're on a water body that has wild rice, taking care to paddle or motor less aggressively in areas where it might be present. So that might be at the inlets or outlets of a lake. Also individual lakeshore property owners, refraining from using lawn fertilizers, herbicides, et cetera. That can all have impacts to manoomin habitat. And sort of on a broader scale, there are lake associations, lake districts that have jurisdiction over these lakes, and for those lakes where manoomin is present, it's worthwhile to make those who share the lake just aware that manoomin is on that water body, and actually the lake district can actually define that area as a no-wake zone, which can, have a measurable impact on the protection of the manoomin present.
And Brandon, briefly, could that be a time-specific thing? Like, hey, this is a no-week zone during this, I don't know what, weeks-long period that's a critical stage in development of manoomin?
Yeah, really anywhere before mid to late June, if you were to implement a no-wake zone, is when it would have its greatest impact.
And Rob, do you have thoughts for what you'd like to see or do next when it comes to research?
Additional research is needed on the impact of our changing winters. We know that manoomin does need cold temperatures and ice cover for it to successfully germinate. And then we hear from some of the tribal programs that they really want to see more research into the impact of land use practices on wild rice.
I'll leave it there. Rob, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
And Brandon, thanks for being with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
That was Brandon Byrne and Rob Kroll with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. We learned about how climate change is leading to a decrease of manoomin, a wild rice plant in the Great Lakes region.
And now be sure to join WPR for the Wisconsin Road Trip Project. It launches today online with an interactive map. It features 9 curated road trips with stops all over the state. There is something for everyone here. We've got themes for ice cream lovers, baseball fans, birders, and bookworms. I'll be checking out the independent bookstore road trip, that is for sure. Find the Wisconsin Road Trip Project at WPR.org. Play around with that interactive map and be sure to listen on Wisconsin Life starting Friday with stories from these stops.
Last week, we asked you to share your favorite memories of school plays and theater programs.
We got a call from Eugene in Viola, who shared his memory of teaching in a one-room schoolhouse over 60 years ago and helping kids put on their Christmas plays.
And it was just a lot of fun. The lower grades did the single pieces, and the upper grades did the plays. And getting it organized and getting it going and changing some of the names in the plays to some of the people in the community, we just had a lot of fun doing it.
Do you have a memory to share from your own school play experiences, whether that was 60 years ago or just last week? Tell us about it.
Reach out to us with your story about school theater. Email wisconsintoday@wpr.org, or you can call or text at 888-642-0232. That's 888-642-0232.
Wisconsin Today producers include Rochelle Wilson, Trevor Hook, and Avery Lee Rogers. Our technical directors are Lee Rayburn and Tyler Ditter. Learn more about us at wpr.org/Wisconsin Today. I'm Rob Farrett.
And I'm Kate Archer-Kent. You're listening to WPR News.